Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a topic that is absolutely fascinating, but it requires, total precision and historical context to really get right. We're going to carefully separate the concept of tactical military deception from the very strict Islamic prohibition on treachery. So let's just dive right in. We're starting with one of the most famous and honestly most widely misunderstood quotes from the 7th century. It's a hadith reported by Ka'b Ibn Malik, which notes that when the Prophet intended to set out on a military expedition, he'd often pretend to head somewhere else, famously stating, "War is deception." Now, if you just look at that on the surface, it sounds like a massive, sweeping rule, right? But the context here is absolutely crucial. It's entirely tied to active military expeditions and specific battlefield strategy. Because out of that single, isolated 7th century quote, a pretty wild modern misconception has sprouted up. Some people look at that phrase and ask, well, does this mean breaking the law or maybe reneging on a modern visa agreement in a foreign host country is perfectly fine? Does war's deception essentially give a blank check for fraud? Well, the text we're analyzing today gives a definitive, resounding no to that. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the war is deception myth. Second, deception versus treachery. Third, we'll cover the laws of war. Fourth, visas and modern covenants. And finally, number 5, treason in historical Medina. Section 1. The war is deception myth. The absolutely crucial point to grasp here is the sheer danger of literal English translations. The source text we're looking at highlights that reading a hadith in English, applying a modern English understanding of the word deception, and then extracting this broad, sweeping ruling from it is a major error in Islamic jurisprudence, or usul al-fiqh. You literally cannot just strip the terminology of its original Arabic, legal, and situational boundaries. If you do, you're going to severely distort the outcome. Okay, moving to Section 2, deception versus treachery. In Arabic, just like in Islamic law, there is a massive gulf between two very distinct concepts. On one hand, we've got khura, which loosely translates to deception. Now, this is strictly related to permitted tactical battlefield maneuvers between active combatants. But on the other hand, we have khiana, which means treachery or breaking an established agreement. Khiana is strictly forbidden in Islam, and that applies whether you're in times of war or peace, zero exceptions. To put khura into a clearer perspective, that permitted tactical deception we just talked about, think about Operation Mincemeat from World War II. British forces literally took the corpse of a homeless man, planted false papers on him, and floated his body ashore to trick the German military about the 1943 Allied invasion of Sicily. It's a classic, universally understood battlefield tactic, right? That is khura. It's completely unrelated to breaking a promise or, say, violating a civil contract. Which brings us to Section 3, the laws of war. This introduces a really foundational legal concept in Islamic law, the aman. An aman is basically a formal security covenant. So in our modern world, your visa or your citizenship acts as an aman. Taking up arms against a country or a people that has already provided you with an aman, that's not considered some clever tactical military move. It's straight up treason. It is the complete antithesis of good conduct in Islamic Sharia. We can really anchor this legal definition with the renowned classical scholar Al-Nawawi. He pointed out that scholars totally agree on the permissibility of deceiving disbelievers during war. But, and this is a massive but, unless it relates to the breaching of an ahud, a covenant, or an aman, security, as that is not halal. So the very second your so-called deception breaches a trust or an established agreement of security, it instantly crosses the line. It becomes illegal. Al-Nawawi goes even further to clarify the limits of something known as indirect speech. Now, it's permissible to speak in a way where your underlying meaning is technically true, even if the listener might understand something else entirely, but again, purely as a tactic. There's a crucial caveat, though. Indirect speech is only permissible as long as it doesn't prevent the fulfillment of a legitimate right. So you absolutely cannot misapply this to, defraud someone. Like selling a defective car or trying to circumvent modern visa requirements, that's a huge misapplication of the rule. Section 4. Visas and modern covenants. Modern scholar Muhammad Ali Yaqoubi is incredibly direct about how this plays out today. He states flat out that deception and treachery are not permissible for Muslims living in Western countries like the US or Canada, or in the Far East like China, or anywhere else really, Brazil, Scandinavia, Australia. The geography honestly doesn't matter. The rule is universal. It's impermissible for them to go against their contract. They absolutely must respect the laws of the lands in which they live. And this modern ruling,
is actually built on a really powerful historical precedence. When the early companions of the Prophet were super vulnerable and facing violent persecution in Mecca, they fled as refugees to Abyssinia. And while they were there, they found security, living peacefully for many years under the shade of a just Christian king. They were granted a covenant of safety, and they honored their residency, respecting the laws of that land completely.
To definitively cap off this legal separation, the Salafi Manhaj puts it like this. Deception is not breaking an agreement. Whoever equalized the two has equalized between what the divine legislation has separated. Basically, creating an analogy between tactical battlefield deception and breaking a formal trust is fundamentally corrupt. It completely opposes both Quranic verses and multiple prophetic traditions, all about fulfilling your trusts. That brings us to Section 5, Treason in Historical Medina. We're looking at the historical case of Ka'b Ibn Al-Ashraf. Now, he was a member of the Jewish tribe Banu Nadir in 7th century Medina, and he was ultimately executed by order of the Prophet. Some extremist interpretations like to point to this specific event, claiming the Prophet's companions used a false covenant of security to lure him out. They use this massive whataboutism to argue that this somehow justifies breaking modern covenants, but as we'll see, the source material provides some critical historical context that completely dismantles that whole narrative. Drawing from the analysis of Yasir Qadhi, we can see the very specific actions Ka'b committed. This wasn't just some arbitrary assassination. Look at the actual grounds for treason here. He formed secret alliances against Medina. His tribe had already violated the Treaty of Medina, the Sahifa, by actively assisting enemy forces. He incited physical war and hatred, and he even sexually enticed the women of Medina in his poetry. He was executed for high treason because he had already completely shattered any existing treaty himself. Furthermore, it's just incredibly dangerous to impose our contemporary legal mechanisms onto 7th century Arabia. People today sometimes try to label this an extrajudicial assassination. But you have to remember, the Prophet's leadership in Medina wasn't just religious, it was the executive and legal authority. So his commands regarding an active, hostile enemy who'd committed treason were inherently judicial rulings issued by the head of state. It was an executive state ruling, not some random act of vigilante deception. All of this leaves us with a pretty profound question to ponder. If a single mistranslated word, confusing tactical deception with malicious treachery, can just totally warp someone's understanding of the law, how many other historical texts are we completely misreading today just because we ignore the context? It truly shows exactly why returning to the original language and understanding the deep, structured jurisprudence is absolutely essential. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.